Let's go to Revelation chapter 12. We're just going to look at a couple of verses tonight. I intended to move a little further than this, but I felt it was going to make this a little too long. So we're just looking at Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 through 9 tonight. So let's read there, verse 7. It says, "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." So this is what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about this war that will take place, as we'll see, in heaven. Now, John has already mentioned, just a few verses prior, he has already mentioned a falling out of heaven for this dragon in verse number 4. He says, "And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and he did cast them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered for to devour her child as soon as it was born." And so he's already described this falling of the dragon once. Now the question is then, do these verses that we just read, 7, 8, 9, do they present to us a new event, or do they simply recapitulate the events of verse number 4? Just kind of talking about it in a different way. Now, I think Daniel answers this question for us. And Daniel, don't turn there, but Daniel chapter 12, you see there in verse number 1, it says, "And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book." And so it specifically mentions a couple of things that we see here. It mentions Michael and this battle, if you will. And then it mentions that immediately after this, there's this time like there never has been. And so that really lines up with what we see taking place here in Revelation chapter 12. And so he's talking about this particular event that is going to take place in the future eventually. So what is going to take place is this is going to happen somewhere around the midpoint. We can't really be dogmatic about this, but it's going to take place somewhere probably directly prior to the midpoint of the tribulation, and it immediately precedes the events of verse 6. And so in verse number 6, we read about the woman. We talked about this last time, how the woman represents Israel, and the woman flees into the wilderness, and then it says there at the end of the verse where she's going to be there for 1,260 days. Well, just to kind of make all this, not take forever, of course, we understand it's 3.5 years. We understand that's taking place the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. And so here in verse 7, 8, and 9, John is describing for us a future event yet to take place, this battle that's going to happen, where John describes this future war between Satan and Michael. And I think that's important. I think it's important that we understand that's between Satan and Michael. I think there's a truth here that we need to grasp. Christ as God, he is God, we understand this, has no counterpart. Jesus and Satan are not two sides of the same coin. They're not counterparts, if you will. Now, you can go read the Old Testament scriptures on this. We understand that Satan was, he was a created being, number one, but he was a very high-ranking, he was the anointed cherub. He was, I think, probably very high up, if you will, in the hierarchy of angelic beings. However, he counterpart of Christ. Christ has no counterpart. It's not Jesus versus Satan, because that's not a fight. If Jesus is versus Satan, Jesus is victorious always. And so here there's a war raging, but it's not between Satan and Jesus, between Satan, his angels, Michael's angels. And so, again, we've kind of discussed this in the past a little bit, but it ought to be a comfort for us. Satan does not have the ability to overwhelm, overpower, or outwit God. He can't. They're not on the same level. And so if you want to give him a counterpart, it's probably Michael. I think Michael would be the best option if you want to give Satan a heavenly counterpart. Now something that is a little bit unsure about this particular battle, and I won't get into this greatly, but is the exact nature of it. And what I mean by that is, will it be a spiritual battle, or is this an actual physical battle that's taking place in heaven? We understand that Angels in their natural state they don't have physical bodies. However, they certainly can manifest physically. We know that to be true as well. So we're not told. We're not told if this is a spiritual battle, if this is an actual physical battle that's going to take place. But what we are told, and the important thing here, is that Satan is unsuccessful. And we see that there in verse number 8. So Satan and Michael, they're battling. In the verse number 8, and he says, and prevailed not. Satan is going to lose this battle. It says, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And so that's another interesting phrase here at the end of verse 8. Neither was there found in heaven. And so this presents to us another kind of a hard truth. If Satan is not yet cast out from heaven ultimately until the tribulation, then he has access to heaven now. All right? If this is something that has yet to take place and is going to take place in the future, then that means he has not yet been completely cast out of heaven, and he now has access. Well, is that true? Yes, it's true. In fact, the Bible bears this out. In fact, if tradition holds true, then we see this happening in the first book of the Bible that was ever written, right? If Job was the first book ever written, and traditionally that's been held to be the case, we see this exact thing taking place. In Job chapter 1 and verses 6 and 7, it says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves where? Before the Lord. They're coming before the Lord to present themselves. It says, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord, said, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And so we see a couple of things here that are consistent with what we know to be true about Satan. First, he spent time walking the earth. That's what he says. I've been walking to and fro on the earth. Well, that's consistent with the New Testament. 1 Peter 5:8. Your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, what does he do? Walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. And so again, this is consistent with what we see about Satan in the New Testament. But also, he spent time in heaven. Now, we didn't get to this verse tonight, but in verse number 10 of chapter 12, it says, for the accuser of our brethren is cast down, and then look at this, which accused them before our God day and night. So what does all this mean? It means that as we sit now, and we're going to talk about this more next week when we get to verse 10, but as we sit now, this means that Satan does have access to heaven. And what does he do with that access? He accuses the brethren. And so he walks around the earth seeking whom he may devour. And what he's doing, and it's probably not all he's doing, but what he's doing is he's gaining the information about us, and he's taking that information to God and saying, hey, look at this pathetic, worthless person that you call one of your children. Look at what they're doing. He's accusing us before God. And so God is able to then, and I don't want to get in my head myself because we'll talk about this more in when we get to verse 10, but God is able to say, listen, Satan, that's been covered. There's blood that's been shed that's covered those sins. Okay? And so Satan will not be victorious. And so there's going to be this battle that will take place in the future that will end this particular access that Satan has to heaven. Now, we understand, and we talked about this back in verse 4 when we talked about the fall of Satan. And so his relationship and his the status that he held in heaven was certainly broken at that point, and he fell. He still has a certain degree of access to heaven now. To what degree that access is, we're really not told. We know that he can come before God and accuse the brethren, but if he can go beyond that, we're not told. But now that his access is cut off, and this is the point, and this is what I really want you to understand, especially with regard to the tribulation. Now that his access is cut off, it tells us there in verse number 9, it says, and the great dragon was cast out. Where was he cast out? Okay, look at the end. He was cast out into the earth. And so we understand he's roaming the earth now. He has access to heaven now. He's called the prince of the air. And so Satan has a certain realm, if you will, right now where he goes back and forth and he does what he's used to. Well, that's going to end. The things that Satan are used to doing now are going to end in the future, and he's not going to be happy about that. And so he's cast out. He doesn't have this access anymore. And verse 6 tells us that God is protecting the woman. He's protecting Israel for 3.5 years. But what does that mean? For 3.5 years, and listen, Satan understands the Bible. Satan knows this stuff. He knows that his time is short. And so he knows for 3.5 years, he's going to come at Israel and Israel's descendants, as we'll see, with everything he has. Now, I want you to think about this again. We've studied a lot already in Revelation. We've seen a lot of terrible things that are going to take place in the book of, or in the tribulation in the future time. And what we have seen up to this point has really been the tribulation from God's perspective. We've seen the judgments that are going to come from God. Add on top of all the terrible things that we've seen, Satan, who is angry because his access has gone, who is angry because ultimately his desire is to overcome God, but he knows that the Scriptures say he only has a few years left. And so if that's true, he's going to be, again, coming at Israel, coming at those who refuse to take the mark, those who refuse to bow the knee. He's going to be coming at them with everything that he possibly has. And so added on top of the horror of all the things that we've read, all the things that we've studied, is going to be this presence of Satan now directly attacking and probably changing the way that he has done things to this point. And so I say all that because we read there in Daniel chapter 12, Jesus makes reference to this in Matthew chapter 24. This is a time like no other time. This is a time like we can't even really begin to fathom. We can't even really begin to imagine how terrible of a time this is going to be. If what we have read up to this point was all that was going to take place, that would be enough. That's already making it as terrible of a time as we can imagine. But now add on top all of that Satan knows his time is limited, and yet he's going to come out with a rage probably that he has not experienced in a long, long time. Now I want to look a little bit more at verse number 9, because John gives a lot of titles here for Satan. And so number 1, he says, the great dragon was cast out, and then he says, that old serpent called the devil and Satan. And then he goes on to say, which deceiveth the whole world. And so I think probably his titles here give us a little bit of an idea of his tactics, if you will. First of all, he calls him the dragon. This speaks to, more than likely, this speaks to his power and his formidable nature. I don't want anybody to mistake this. He is a very powerful foe. We don't need to misunderstand that just because we're in Christ, we can do whatever we want when it comes to Satan. That's not the case. In fact, what do we see in Jude? Now, granted, it's a very odd text where Michael is disputing with Satan over the body of Moses. And what does it say? Michael was very careful in the way that he came against Satan, and he says, the Lord rebuke you. And so we got to understand that he is a powerful foe, and that is symbolized here by describing him as this great red dragon. Although we do need to point this out, and I like that John Phillips says this. Satan may be, but he is not almighty. And I think we need to understand that as well. And so ultimately, again, I mean, we have the words of God here in front of us. We understand ultimately he loses. Ultimately he does not prevail. But don't misunderstand or misstate his power. Well, that's probably an argument for another time. But don't into the spiritual battle misunderstanding your foe. You're setting yourself up for some failure there. So number 1, he's called the great dragon. Earlier it was the great red dragon. Number 2 there in verse number 9, he's called that old serpent. Well, obviously that brings imagery into the mind. This is recognizing his part in the original sin there in Genesis chapter 3 as he's manifested there as the serpent. And we understand in Genesis 3:1 it tells us that the serpent was subtle. That word meaning shrewd or crafty. And he is. He's shrewd. He's crafty. He's wise. He understands people. And I know I've said this a lot, but I'll say it again. He's very good at understanding people, and add on top of that, he's had thousands of years of studying and watching and seeing how human beings think and operate. If you had thousands of years, we would probably have a much better understanding of people in general as it is. Well, he's had that. And so he's had thousands of years to watch us, to study us, and all the while formulating different ways in which to cause us to stumble or to fall. And then and on top of that, he was already created as a very incredible, magnificent being as it was. And so he was subtle, he was crafty, he was shrewd, and all that was taking place there in Genesis chapter 3 as the serpent. And that's what that calls back to there in verse number 9. Next, he's a popular name there called the devil. Now that word simply it means slanderer. It means slanderer. This is what Satan does before God. Again, verse 10, he accuses the brethren before God day and night. And so he slanders and he accuses the children of God. This is what he does. And so this is one of the reasons, I talked about it earlier, that he walks around the earth. And it is one of the ways in which he tries to devour, is to accuse and to slander. And then the last title that he gives there is simply Satan. Now that word means adversary. That's what the word means. This is who he is. Ever since he was swept away with his own pride, he became the adversary of God and all those who follow him. And of course, you can read about that in Isaiah and in the book of Ezekiel, and you can see how he was created and the magnificence with which he was created. And then Isaiah talks about the pride that he fell in, and you can see there in Isaiah 14 over and over and over again, I will be like the Most High, I will overcome, I will be on the throne, all of these things. Satan had a pride issue, and so he is now, because of that fall, he is our adversary. And then you take all those things and you kind of combine them together. What does he do with all of that? Well, as it says there in verse 9, he deceives the world. That's what he does. He's a deceiver. The dragon, the serpent, devil, Satan, he uses all that he can to deceive. It says in John 8, it says, he was a murderer from the beginning, and he abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, here's what it says, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. He's deceptive by his very nature. And so, which again should help us understand the depths to which he will go to deceive, and furthermore, how good he is at it. And so, as we have seen, as I discussed this earlier, the tribulation, and particularly the second half, I'm not trying to diminish the things that take place in the first, but the second half, what we would refer to as the Great Tribulation, is a terror unlike anything ever seen. Again, Daniel 12, Matthew 24, Jesus speaks about this. Added to the horrific judgments of God that we have already studied is now this rage that Satan has. Again, you can see there in verse number 6, as he understands